The Middle Ages, spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, was a period marked by profound cultural, religious, and political transformations in Europe. Within this context, painting was not merely an artistic pursuit, but also a powerful vehicle for religious instruction and social cohesion. Churches, cathedrals, and monasteries became the primary centers of artistic production, where painting techniques evolved to serve both aesthetic and didactic purposes. From monumental frescoes covering entire walls to delicate illuminated manuscripts, from vibrant stained glass windows to intricately painted wooden panels, each method reflected the spiritual and material conditions of its time. Unlike the modern notion of the artist as an individual creator, the medieval painter was often seen as an instrument of divine inspiration and collective belief, producing works that emphasized symbolism and moral instruction rather than personal expression. The techniques employed, whether fresco, tempera, mosaic, manuscript illumination, or stained glass, not only showcased the technological possibilities of the age but also reinforced the central role of religious symbolism in medieval society. 1. The fresco technique in the Middle Ages. The fresco technique stands as one of the most iconic methods of painting in the medieval period, deeply connected to the religious, cultural, and architectural environment of the time. A fresco is essentially a mural painting created by applying pigments onto freshly laid lime plaster. Unlike paintings on wood or parchment, frescoes became part of the very structure of the building, creating a permanent and monumental presence. This technique, inherited from antiquity and perfected in the Middle Ages, was highly valued for its durability and its ability to cover vast surfaces with vivid narrative scenes. Fresco painting was most commonly found in churches, chapels, and monasteries, where walls and ceilings became canvases for biblical storytelling. At a time when the majority of the population was illiterate, frescoes served a dual function. They beautified sacred spaces and simultaneously acted as visual scripture, conveying the narratives of the Old and New Testaments. The fresco, therefore, was not simply an artistic decoration, but an instrument of religious education and devotion. The technical process, the execution of a fresco, required both technical mastery and precise timing. The wall surface had to be prepared in layers. First, a rough layer of plaster called the arriccio was applied to the wall to create a solid base. Over this, artists would often sketch preliminary drawings, sometimes with charcoal or red ochre, called synopia. Once the designs were ready, a finer layer of wet plaster called intonaco was applied in small sections. This was the crucial stage. The pigments, mixed with water, had to be painted quickly and directly onto the wet plaster before it dried. The chemical reaction between lime and water caused the pigments to fuse into the surface as the plaster set, creating an image that was literally embedded in the wall. This chemical bond gave frescoes their remarkable durability, allowing them to survive centuries with their colors relatively intact. Unlike oil or tempera painting, where pigments sit on the surface, fresco painting ensured that the pigments became part of the wall itself. Durability and limitations. One of the greatest advantages of the fresco technique was its longevity. Even today, many medieval frescoes retain their vividness despite being exposed to environmental wear. The binding process with lime created surfaces resistant to fading. However, frescoes also had limitations. Because the artist had to work quickly before the plaster dried, there was little room for error. This required not only artistic skill but also meticulous planning. Large fresco programs were often divided into sections called giornate, Italian for days, representing the portion of wall that could be completed in a single working day. Careful scheduling was therefore essential. The range of colors was also limited. Since not all pigments could withstand the alkaline environment of lime plaster, some hues, particularly bright blues and deep reds, had to be applied later as a secco on dry plaster. Unfortunately, these additions were less durable and have often faded or flaked away, leaving gaps in the original brilliance of the compositions. Still, the fresco technique provided a visual power unmatched by other painting methods of the period. Iconography and religious function. The choice of fresco for churches and cathedrals was not accidental. Its monumental scale allowed artists to cover entire walls and ceilings with elaborate cycles of religious imagery. Frescoes often depicted Christ's Pantocrator, the Virgin Mary, scenes from the life of Christ, the Last Judgment, and the lives of saints. The fresco thus functioned as a form of medieval media, powerful, persuasive, and memorable. Just as manuscripts transmitted sacred texts through words, frescoes conveyed them through images. This visual catechism was essential in a society where only clergy and scholars had access to literacy. For ordinary worshippers, frescoes were a gateway to understanding divine mysteries. Regional variations. While the fresco technique was used widely across Europe, regional styles developed in response to local traditions. In Italy, frescoes were characterized by narrative cycles with naturalistic figures, foreshadowing the Renaissance style. Byzantine frescoes, on the other hand, favored more abstract and symbolic imagery, with flat forms and golden backgrounds that emphasized spirituality over realism. In Northern Europe, frescoes often incorporated local folklore and moral lessons, blending Christian themes with cultural identity. Tempera technique and its dominance. Tempera painting stood as the cornerstone of medieval artistic practice for centuries, representing not only a technical method but also a cultural language that defined the very nature of visual expression during the Middle Ages. Unlike the fluidity and luminosity later associated with oil painting, tempera was valued for its precision, durability, and capacity to embody spiritual themes with an almost austere clarity. Its roots stretched back to antiquity, and throughout the medieval period it remained the dominant medium used by painters working in manuscripts, panel paintings, and altarpieces. The significance of tempera was not merely technical but deeply tied to the religious and social contexts in which these artworks were produced. In this sense, the technique became inseparable from the devotional practices, aesthetic ideals, and symbolic frameworks of medieval Europe. At its core, tempera painting was based on the careful combination of pigment with a binding medium, most commonly egg yolk. The egg yolk acted as a fast-drying and stable binder, providing a smooth, matte surface that preserved the vividness of mineral and organic pigments. Artists would grind pigments painstakingly by hand, mixing them into fine powders and then blending them with small quantities of yolk and water to create a workable paste. This mixture demanded great technical skill, as it dried quickly, leaving little room for error or extensive reworking. The immediacy of tempera painting required precision, patience, and an almost meditative concentration, qualities that aligned perfectly with the contemplative spirituality of the medieval period. The process of preparing the surface for tempera was equally laborious. Painters typically worked on wooden panels, which were carefully smoothed, coated with gesso, a mixture of chalk and glue, and then polished to create a flawless surface. On top of this prepared ground, artists sketched the initial outlines of their compositions, often with charcoal or a stylus. Gold leaf was frequently applied at this stage, adhering to areas coated with bowl clay and later burnished to achieve brilliance. Only then would the tempera layers be added, applied in delicate strokes and built up gradually to create depth, volume, and luminosity. Despite the matte quality of tempera, the combination of finely layered paint and shimmering gold backgrounds produced a striking contrast, imbuing images with the transcendental glow that resonated with the sacred subject matter. Tempera's dominance was closely linked to its suitability for religious art. Medieval artists and patrons regarded the technique as particularly appropriate for the representation of holy figures and sacred narratives. The flat, luminous surfaces emphasized clarity and legibility over illusionistic depth, aligning with the theological belief that sacred images should convey divine truths rather than imitate earthly appearances. Saints, angels, and biblical scenes were rendered with sharp outlines, stylized gestures, and symbolic color schemes, all of which were enhanced by the properties of tempera. The brilliance of ultramarine blue, vermilion red, and gold backgrounds served to elevate the figures beyond the mundane world, reinforcing their spiritual significance. Moreover, tempera painting was not simply a matter of materials and technique but also of cultural continuity and authority. The method was deeply rooted in the traditions of Byzantine art, which exerted immense influence over medieval European painting. The Byzantine legacy emphasized a codified system of iconography, where images adhered to strict conventions intended to preserve orthodoxy and prevent misinterpretation. Tempera, with its clear lines, flat planes, and stable colors, was ideally suited for maintaining this visual language. Even as regional styles began to develop in Italy, France, and other parts of Europe, the reliance on tempera ensured a degree of consistency across Christian art, uniting diverse cultures under a shared artistic vocabulary. The technique also shaped the workshop practices of the time. Medieval painters often worked in guilds or under the patronage of religious institutions, where tempera was taught as a disciplined craft. Apprentices learned to prepare pigments, apply gesso, and handle the delicate layering process long before they were permitted to execute major work. This training system reinforced the perception of painting as a craft rooted in tradition and technical mastery, rather than an individualistic pursuit of personal expression. The reliance on tempera further emphasized collective knowledge and continuity, tying the practice of painting to broader cultural and religious structures. Despite its enduring dominance, tempera also imposed limitations that would eventually lead to its decline. Its fast-drying nature made blending difficult, resulting in images that relied on linearity and precision rather than atmospheric effects or naturalistic shading. Depth and volume could be suggested only through the careful layering of fine strokes, rather than through smooth gradations of tone. As artistic tastes shifted during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the demand for more naturalistic, illusionistic representations grew stronger. The development of all painting techniques in Northern Europe, with their capacity for richer colors, greater flexibility, and more subtle modeling, eventually overshadowed tempera. Nonetheless, tempera's dominance during the medieval era cannot be underestimated. It defined the visual culture of an age, shaping not only the appearance of sacred art but also the ways in which viewers engaged with it. The clarity, durability, and spiritual resonance of tempera made it the perfect medium for an era that valued order, devotion, and symbolism over naturalistic representation. Even after the rise of oil painting, the legacy of tempera continued to influence artistic practices, with many Renaissance masters trained in its use before adopting new techniques. Today, the surviving works in tempera stand as a testament to the skill, devotion, and cultural significance of this method, offering modern audiences a glimpse into the technical artistry and symbolic imagination of the Middle Ages. Fresco painting and wall decoration. Fresco painting represented one of the most significant artistic achievements of the Middle Ages, a medium that not only covered walls with color but also transformed architectural spaces into immersive environments of spiritual and cultural meaning. Unlike panel painting or manuscript illumination, fresco was inseparable from the very structure it adorned. It turned stone walls and vaulted ceilings into visual narratives, binding art to architecture in ways that were both technically challenging and symbolically profound. From Romanesque chapels to Gothic cathedrals, frescoes communicated biblical stories, saintly legends, and moral allegories to audiences who often could not read but who could nonetheless understand complex theological ideas through images. In this sense, fresco painting was not merely a decorative practice but a cornerstone of medieval pedagogy, spirituality, and communal identity. At the heart of fresco painting lay a unique technical process that demanded extraordinary precision and speed. The method involved applying pigments directly onto freshly laid lime plaster while it was still damp, a technique known as buon fresco. As the wall dried, the pigments chemically bonded with the plaster, creating colors that became part of the wall itself. This chemical fusion gave frescoes their remarkable durability, allowing them to survive centuries of environmental changes, sometimes in better condition than works painted on wood or canvas. However, this durability came at a price. Artists had to work with great swiftness and accuracy, completing each section of a fresco before the plaster dried. This required meticulous planning, with designs divided into giornate, or daily sections, each of which had to be executed flawlessly within a single working day. Despite its enduring significance, fresco painting was not without limitations. The technique's reliance on wall surfaces meant that works could not be moved or traded like panel paintings. Moreover, the demand for rapid execution and bold design often limited the level of minute detail achievable in fresco compared to manuscript illumination or tempera on wood. As the Renaissance unfolded, artists began to experiment with combining fresco with other media, introducing secco techniques, painting on dry plaster to add finishing touches or enhance color vibrancy. Still, the core identity of fresco remained tied to its monumental, architectural character, and it continued to flourish alongside newer techniques. In the final analysis, fresco painting epitomized the integration of art, architecture, and communal life in the Middle Ages. Its technical challenges demanded discipline and mastery, while its visual language communicated profound theological and moral truths to audiences across Europe. More than any other medium, fresco transformed buildings into living narratives, shaping the spiritual and cultural environment of medieval society. Even as artistic practices evolved in later centuries, the legacy of medieval frescoes endured, influencing Renaissance masters and reminding future generations of the extraordinary capacity of art to merge permanence, devotion, and collective meaning.